Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about asking for a letter of recommendation. Now, this is going to apply either for undergrads or grad students. When you are, if you're a professional academic and you're asking for a letter of recommendation for something like the job market or tenure, promotion, things like that, applications, slightly different guidelines. But for undergrads and graduate students applying to graduate school, applying to transfer to a different university, applying for whatever it is, couple of things you should keep in mind when you're asking for a letter of recommendation. I've gotten asked for recommendations by a decent number of students over the years. In part, I think that is because as a person who has taught composition and rhetoric classes that are relatively small and where I actually get to know my students' names, I actually know students personally on an individual level, whereas a lot of their instructors, particularly for first and second year students, tend to be instructors in lecture classes who don't know who they are. And that's actually really sound logic in terms of choosing a recommender. If you can choose someone who individually knows you, they will be able to talk in more detail about your work, about who you are, about your work ethic, about your values, your aspirations, whatever it is. And so finding an instructor or a recommender who knows you and can talk in detail about you is really, really important. That's always the case with letters of recommendation. But that can be much harder for particularly early career undergrad students if most of your classes are lecture classes. This is one of the reasons, incidentally, I would encourage you to go to your instructor's office hours and just sort of start getting to know them, start sort of figuring out what goes on in their field. What are the kinds of things that they do? What are the things that people who work on their discipline are interested in and things like this, especially if this is a gen ed class that's related to your major. Because if you can have those personal connections, you're going to have much stronger letters of recommendation. So that's one thing to be thinking about. Another thing to be thinking about, and this is again a little bit harder to assess for early career undergrads, but for later career undergrads, especially seniors, and for grad students, this is probably going to be much easier to assess. Is this person relatively prominent? The more prominent a person you can get to write you a letter of recommendation, generally the better. I got asked as a grad student, I got asked even as a master's student to write letters of recommendation on the basis that, again, I knew these students personally, whereas a lot of their other instructors didn't. And whenever I was asked as a grad student, I to a certain extent still do this, but not as much because, never mind, I'm a little bit later and more established in my career. But especially as a grad student, whenever somebody asked me to write a letter of recommendation, I would say, look, I'm happy to write on your behalf, but I want you to be aware, as a grad student, I have very little institutional power or authority. My recommendation is not going to count as much as someone who is tenured, especially, as much as someone who is known in your field. Like, this is one of the things. If you are taking a class with a grad student, it's not a bad thing necessarily to have a grad student write you a really good recommendation, but a grad student does not have a reputation. A grad student is not going to be known to the people that you want to be recommended to. And so if you can get a letter from someone who is known to the people that you are applying to, that will be more impressive to them. There are people, and this happened more back in the day. This is slightly less common now because of institutional changes in academia. But like, there are people who got jobs purely on the strength of who their recommenders were. So that's a thing to be aware of when you're choosing who you would want to potentially write a letter of recommendation for you. Is who is the most prominent person that I can get who can do a decent job? Now, the caveat to this is that there are, of course, horror stories of very, very prominent instructors, people who are famous, who have just a stock letter of recommendation, and then they will just have like a TA write the person's name on it, and then they'll sign it at the bottom, and that's it. Like, they don't actually write letters of recommendation as such. And so that's another potential pitfall to worry about. That is, I think, the exception rather than the rule, so that's not probably something you need to be massively, massively worried about. But try and find out if someone has a reputation as a good letter writer, because this is the other thing that can balance it out. If you have a prominent name, but they've written a stock letter that doesn't actually reflect on you as an individual, that may not help. That may actually hurt your case. Whereas a really personalized, detailed, positive letter from a relative unknown may be more effective. So those are some of the things you want to think about when you're considering who can write you a letter or who might write you a letter. Now, when you actually approach that person, I think email is fine. I have had people ask me in person if I would write letters of recommendation for them, but generally people email. It's 2023 or the future, whenever you're watching this, 2024, 2025, however long the internet lasts and people watch this video, whatever it is, email is a thing. It exists. It makes everybody's communications easier to actually remember what we're committing to do. So I think email is fine. Be polite in the email. Use a subject line that tells the reader of the email that you are going to request a letter of recommendation. Be clear that you are asking for a letter of recommendation. I have on occasion had students treat the request as though it were an obligation on my part. I have had students who have just assumed that I will write for them. That is the minority of students who have requested letters from me. Overwhelmingly, students do ask, but make sure that you do. Not everybody. So some people just don't write letters of recommendation on principle. I don't understand the principle, but they have a principle about that. So some people will just say no. Some people will say, look, I'd love to do this, but I've got a bunch of work right now and I can't do it by the time you would need the letter. I'm sorry. Some people will say, I'm just not in a good position to write this letter. And I've actually been in that instance where I really, really, really did not want to write a letter of recommendation for the student, but he kind of guilted me into it because the person he had originally had, he said, the person, and I don't doubt this, but what he told me is that the person he had originally had lined up to write this letter dropped out, and then he needed to scramble to find somebody. The problem was I really hadn't seen any of his work at that point, so I didn't have much to say about him that could go into a letter of recommendation, and I really tried to turn it down, and he was basically like, there isn't anybody else. Like, I've asked all of the other people I could think of. Nobody can do it or will do it. And I finally was like, okay. But the reality is, like, this is one of the things, is sometimes your instructors will not want to write for you for one reason or another. If you did not do fantastically well in their class and they're aware of that, they may not want to write for you. Because the thing is, most people, I think, do not want to write a letter of recommendation where they are not saying positive stuff. And if they don't know you well enough to really talk about you, if they don't have a positive impression of you, they're not going to want to say positive stuff, or they're not going to be able to honestly say positive stuff. And so that's something you want to be aware of. Again, if a recommender turns down your request, it's possible that they just genuinely don't have the time. We, as academics, we are very, very busy, and there are particular points in the semester when we're busier than others. It's also possible that they are trying to do you a favor by not sending in a subpar letter of recommendation on your behalf. So these are things to be aware of. But you, again, the upshot of that is, when you request this letter of recommendation, remember you are asking someone to do you a favor that they do not necessarily have to do, and that they do not necessarily want to do. So it is a request. Think about what kinds of details you need to include for this person to be able to agree to do this and to do this successfully. So basically that would be things like, one, when is the deadline for this? When does this letter need to be written? Because that may very well determine whether or not the person can write the letter. If there's not enough, if you have a very, very short turnaround time and they are quite busy at the moment, that may kneecap them being able to write this letter. So that's one thing. When is the deadline? Where are you applying? What are you applying for? Is this program? Is this a major? If so, what is it? Is this a different school? Is this a graduate program? Is this a job? Is this an internship? Is this a study abroad program? What kind of thing are you applying for? Why are you applying for it? What is it that you want to achieve by doing this thing? Why should I recommend you? And then if there's any additional information, like some recommendations require a specific format, or traditionally there was the letter of recommendation. Now some places are not doing a letter, they're doing sort of enter text about answering specific questions about the person being recommended. If you have that information, that's useful to your recommender, because I have written letters of recommendation and then gone into submit the letter and found out they don't want a letter. So that would have been useful information before I did the labor of writing the letter. So these kinds of things are what you're thinking about here. What kind of information do I need to give? Making sure that you are asking for a recommendation and then trying to figure out who the best person to actually recommend you is, given a wide range of factors.